They left me nothing. After a lifetime of quiet loyalty of keeping their bills paid and their books balanced, my parents gave everything to my younger sister Clara. The house, the antique shop, the family name me. I got a thank you and a lawyer's cold shrug. 2 years later, Clara called me in tears. The business was gone. Debt collectors were circling. She whispered, "You've always been good with money. Can you help me?" What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I did have money. A lot of it. Not from them, but from something they forgot. And I never did. So I made my decision. I didn't scream. I didn't fight. I simply said no. And that silence. It was louder than any revenge. If you've ever been the forgotten child, the one who gave everything and got nothing back, this story is for you. Don't just watch from the sidelines. Subscribe now to hear the full truth, because some betrayals deserve to be told, all the way to the end. My name is Eleanor Vance. I'm 58 years old, and for most of my life, I played the role no one notices, quiet, dependable, invisible. I live in Charleston, South Carolina, where the summers are heavy and the silence hangs thick. I'm a librarian. I drink 1 cup of coffee every morning, take the same route to work, and file the same overdue notices without complaint. My parents never really approved of the life I chose. They used to call it small. They wanted big things, titles, business expansion parties, magazine features. They got that in my younger sister Clara. Clara was everything I wasn't. Flashy, loud, ambitious. She married young, divorced, dramatically, and somehow always landed on her feet. She had a knack for making bad decisions look like acts of bravery. Our parents adored her for it. They owned an antique shop in the French Quarter, charming, cluttered, and full of history. I loved that store. I practically grew up behind the counter. But Clara was the heir, and everyone knew it. Even as kids, our mother would say Clara has the flair. Eleanor's good with numbers, but business needs vision, so I became the background, the fixer. The quiet one who kept things running when no one else was looking. When my father's health started to fade, it was me who stepped in to help. I organized their paperwork, streamlined their inventory, paid their taxes, and negotiated overdue invoices. Clara breezed in, only for the photos, smiling for customers, giving interviews about the family legacy. Not once did they say thank you. Not once did I expect it. There's a certain kind of grief that comes from knowing you were never truly seen. Not for who you are, but for how useful you could be. I didn't argue when I found out they named Clara executor of the estate. I didn't flinch when I saw the will. The house. The shop. The furniture. Even the dusty paintings our grandfather smuggled out of post-war Europe. All of it went to her. To me. A check for $4,000, labeled with appreciation for your support. I remember holding it and thinking, they really thought that was enough. But here's what they didn't know. Years ago, when I was about 10, my grandfather set up a small trust in my name, a forgotten investment in a regional textile fund. It wasn't much at the time, barely a few $1,000s. My parents never mentioned it again, and I never reminded them, but I checked on it, I nurtured it, I diversified when the time was right. Quietly, cautiously. By the time Clara inherited the empire, my forgotten little fund had grown into a portfolio large enough to buy the entire antique shop 3 times over. But I didn't flaunt it. I didn't even use it. I watched Clara host auctions and cocktail events. I watched her rename the shop, Clara's Curiosities. I watched her ignore invoices, fire longtime employees, and install chandeliers that didn't match the century of the house. And I watched the numbers fall. You see, I never needed revenge. I just wanted peace. I wanted to live without being measured against someone else's fantasy. So I waited. And when the call finally came, when Clara's voice cracked on the phone and she whispered, "I need help," that was the first time I felt truly powerful, because I knew what came next would be on my terms, and this time, I wouldn't be invisible. Clara's voice shook when she called. I hadn't heard from her in over a year. Last I knew, she'd hosted a grand reopening gala for the shop, invited a city councilman, got featured in the lifestyle section of the paper. She wore red that night. Bright, expensive red, the kind that says, "I'm winning." But now she sounded small, Defeated Eleanor. I didn't know who else to call. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the phone. Part of me wanted to hang up. Another part, the older, softer part, just listened. She didn't jump straight to the ask. She told me stories first, how the new business model never quite caught on, how a supplier scammed her out of several thousand, how foot traffic had dried up, how the mortgage ballooned. I tried to keep it going, she said. I really did. I waited. Then came the real reason. I need $50,000 just to hold off the bank. I know you have savings. Please. It wasn't just the money she wanted. It was rescue. She wanted to be plucked out of her mistakes and placed gently back on her pedestal. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I drove by the shop the next morning. It was still standing, but barely. The windows were dusty, and the once charming hand-painted sign had started to peel. A man in a rumpled suit paced out front, phone pressed to his ear. Probably another collector. Inside the shelves were sparse, priceless heirlooms traded for cash flow and desperation. I stood across the street and remembered everything. The summer I worked 3 jobs so my parents could keep the lights on. The winter I skipped heating my own apartment so I could cover their missed property tax. The birthday, Clara forgot. The Christmas card signed, "Thanks for everything." And the will, that damn will, $50,000, to save a legacy I was never allowed to inherit. Clara texted that afternoon, "Please don't make me lose the house. It's all we have left of them." Funny. Now she called it we. What followed were weeks of pleading emails, voicemails, long rambling letters about childhood memories, about Mom's laugh, about Dad's antique record player. She clung to nostalgia like it was currency, but I'd lived in those memories too. And I remembered them differently. I remembered the way Dad praised Clara for being a real businesswoman while I balanced his checkbook. I remembered Mom brushing past me in the kitchen asking if I was still playing librarian. I remembered how often they'd tell people Clara's our legacy, so I didn't respond. Not yet, and that silence, it did something to her. Suddenly her messages grew sharp. "You're punishing me for things I didn't control, then you're being cruel, and finally you've always been jealous." I almost laughed. I'd spent my life shrinking myself to fit their frame, quiet, safe, easy to ignore. But now in silence, I was finally being seen. People started asking questions. A mutual cousin reached out. "Clara says you're letting her drown." A former employee emailed me. "I always thought you should have run the shop." Even my mother's oldest friend, who used to call me the serious one, sent a message. "I wish they'd seen what I saw in you," and that meant more than Clara's crocodile tears. Still, I didn't answer. Instead, I waited. Waited for the auction signs to go up. Waited for the shop to be listed on Zillow for less than half its appraised value. Waited for Clara to learn the lesson our parents never taught her, that loyalty once taken for granted doesn't return on command. She had to watch the empire crumble brick by brick, heirloom by heirloom. And me, I watched too. But not with bitterness, not even with satisfaction. I watched with peace. Because sometimes, the truest revenge is just not saving them. The final plea didn't come through a phone call or a letter. It came in person. Clara showed up at my front door. She looked thinner, not glamorously thin like she used to aim for. This was a sunken kind of thin stress weight. Her eyes had lost that polished sparkle, and for the first time in decades she wasn't wearing makeup. She didn't even wait for me to invite her in, just stepped into my living room like it was still 1992, and we were sharing bunk beds again. "Eleanor," she said softly, "I'm losing everything." She didn't cry. "Not yet. I know I made mistakes. I was too proud. I was careless, but I can fix it. I just need help just this once. I know you have money." There it was. No more pretense. No more nostalgia or sisterly bonding. Just the truth. She saw me as a safety net, not a sister, not a partner, just a resource. I sat across from her in silence. She stared at me like I owed her something, like all those years she'd been chosen and praised and elevated that somehow made her right. "Mom and Dad always thought you'd be the one who needed help someday," she added. "They thought you'd end up bitter and broke." I looked her straight in the eye. Well, they were wrong. That was the moment. The point where the road forked for good. I could have saved her. I could have wired the money, called my financial manager, even bought back the antique shop myself and let her run it again. But I didn't. Because in that moment I realized what she truly wanted wasn't just the money, it was to remain the center of the story, to be rescued, to be absolved. She never once asked how I was doing, never asked what I'd built or sacrificed. Never wondered how the bitter librarian ended up with the power to write checks that could erase six-figure debt. I thought back to a journal my grandfather once gave me, hidden among his old war memorabilia. Inside the cover he'd written, "Don't chase legacy, build peace, and let the world catch up." That journal, like the fund he left me, was something only I ever cared enough to keep, and now, decades later, both had quietly given me freedom. I stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the street was quiet. A few children rode past on bikes. The scent of gardenias hung in the air. I turned to Clara. "I won't be helping you." Her mouth opened, slightly stunned. "You've made your choices?" I said, my voice steady. "And now you live with them just like I lived with mine." She stared at me like she didn't recognize the woman in front of her. "You're really going to let me lose everything?" "No," I said softly. "You already lost it. I'm just not stepping in to cushion the fall." She didn't say goodbye when she left, just slammed the door, got into her car, and sped off. I stood in the doorway long after she was gone. There was no rage in me, no guilt, no satisfaction either. Just stillness. This wasn't revenge. This was release. It was the moment I stopped being the background character in someone else's story and started living mine. That was the point of no return. Not for Clara, for me. I didn't tell anyone what I was planning. Not that it was some grand strategy. It was quiet, simple, intentional. I started with the files. The dusty banker's box under my bed held decades of notes, balance sheets, and records of every late payment I'd made on my parents' behalf. I scanned the statements, archived the receipts, and labeled each file by year. It was like watching a silent documentary of my own life, the years I skipped vacations, postponed dentist appointments, and worked overtime just to cover for someone else's mess. For the first time, I wasn't doing it for them. I was doing it to close the book. Next, I reached out to a realtor, not for Clara's property. For me, I bought a cottage on the outskirts of Charleston. One-story brick facade, a porch that faced a slow-moving creek. It wasn't fancy, but it had everything I wanted: privacy, light, and silence. It was mine, fully paid in cash, no signatures needed but my own. Then I closed my old bank accounts, the ones still linked to the joint utility bills I once paid for my parents, the emergency credit line I'd opened in Clara's name during her second divorce, gone, deleted, no trace left. She wouldn't even realize it until she tried to lean on me again and found nothing but a hollow dial tone. I also drafted a new will, a simple one, no dramatic clauses or punishments, just clarity. My estate would be divided among 3 charities: the local library's literacy program, a women's shelter I once stayed in for a week after Mom's temper got out of hand, and a scholarship fund for girls studying accounting. Clara wasn't mentioned, not out of spite, out of truth. She had taken more than her share of my life already. I wasn't giving her a posthumous inch. 1 week later, the antique shop went on auction. I didn't attend in person, but I watched it live-streamed. The bidders weren't collectors or preservationists, they were investors. They saw a gutted building with a recognizable zip code. Sentimental value didn't factor into their equations. The shop sold for $184,000, far below its worth. Clara cried as she signed the papers. I heard about it from one of the staff she'd fired a year earlier. Apparently, she said something like, "Eleanor could have saved this, but she wanted to see me fail." She still didn't understand. This wasn't about seeing her fail. This was about choosing not to drown with her. A few days later, I walked past the building they'd already taken down, the Clara's Curiosities sign. It leaned against a dumpster, out back, chipped and crooked. I paused, staring at it, not with anger, but with distance. It felt like a museum piece. A relic from a life I'd outgrown. Back home I made tea, sat on my new porch, Listen to the crickets humming beyond the creek. For the first time in years, I had no bills to pay for someone else. No late-night phone calls. No guilt hanging over me like a rain cloud. I was light-free, in control. I didn't call Clara. I didn't gloat. I didn't write some letter reminding her of all the things I did for our family. She wouldn't read it. She'd never believed my worth could stand without comparison to hers, so I let silence answer the questions she never asked. Weeks passed, then months, and Clara disappeared from Charleston. Rumor had it she moved out west, tried to start another boutique business. I didn't check. I didn't want to know. Because I wasn't living in her orbit anymore. I was building something slower, quieter, stronger. I joined a local garden club, learned how to grow tomatoes from seeds. Started volunteering once a week at the literacy center, taught a young girl how to balance a checkbook just like I once taught myself at 12 when no one else bothered to explain. One afternoon, as I filed paperwork for the scholarship fund, I wrote down something without thinking. Value doesn't scream, it builds quietly. And just like that, I knew that had always been my plan. Not revenge, not rescue, just a life of my own built on my terms. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon when I saw Clara again. I hadn't expected it. I was at the local farmer's market comparing jars of honey when I heard someone say my name softly, but with that same old sharpness beneath it. Eleanor, I turned. She looked tired. No makeup again, no jewelry. Her posture was smaller, like life had sanded down every edge, but even in her worn jeans and faded blouse, Clara still had that air of performance. Like she couldn't decide if she wanted to cry or win the argument. I didn't think I'd run into you, she said, forcing a smile. I nodded but said nothing, just waited. She looked down at her shoes, then back up. I sold everything, the house, the business. Even Mom's silver. I'm living in a studio apartment now. I teach yoga to seniors. Isn't that funny? I didn't laugh. She kept going, words spilling like she'd rehearsed them. I kept waiting for you to call. I thought maybe you'd come around. I mean, we're still family, right? That word family landed like a stone between us. I needed help. Eleanor, I didn't think you'd actually let it all fall apart. I finally answered. You didn't need help. You needed consequences. Her face flinched, not dramatically, just a flicker. She stepped closer. So this was revenge. After all these years, you finally got to punish me. No, I said this was freedom, and I didn't take it from you. You gave it away piece by piece. The silence between us was long. She glanced around like the world might step in and defend her. But no one was watching. No audience this time. Just two sisters standing in the middle of a Sunday market with peaches on one side and truth on the other. I loved that shop, she whispered. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say about it. That shop had loved neither of us. It had been a monument to favoritism built on my labor and her spotlight. And now it was gone. She tried again. Do you ever think about them, Mom and Dad, all the time? I said. That surprised her. I think about what they taught me, what not to accept, what not to become. Her lip trembled just a little. She wasn't the villain. That's the part people always misunderstand. Clara didn't wake up one day and decide to destroy things. She simply never learned how to value what wasn't handed to her. And I spent decades learning how to build quietly. How to hold my breath until it was safe to breathe. Now I was breathing. I hope you're okay, I added, and I meant it. Because at the end of the day, this wasn't about punishment. It was about peace. She turned to leave but paused. You really had that much saved up? I gave a half smile. More than you'll ever know. And with that she walked away. No screams, no dramatic exits, just footsteps fading into the noise of the crowd. Later that night, I sat on my porch sipping tea, listening to the cicadas buzz in the trees. I thought about legacy, not the kind our parents chased. Not a name etched in stone or a business listed in the city register, but the quieter kind, like teaching a girl to read her first contract, or showing a single mother how to create a budget, or planting tomatoes that would feed a neighbor. That was my legacy now, and Clara. She'd have to build hers from scratch. the way I once did. The fallout wasn't an explosion, it was a long, quiet settling of dust, and in the stillness I found everything I needed. People think revenge is loud, explosive, the slamming of doors, the shouting of truths, the dramatic end of a relationship, but mine was none of that. Mine was a quiet no. A steady withdrawal, a refusal to carry what was never mine to hold. In the months that followed, I didn't hear from Clara again. She faded into the background of Charleston just as I once had. Maybe she started over, maybe she learned, maybe not. But I didn't need to know, because for the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting to be seen, I was simply living. My days are small but full. I volunteer, I plant, I read, I listen. I give not out of guilt but out of choice, and that has made all the difference. I still pass by the old antique shop now and then. It's a boutique wine bar now. Polished wood floors, minimalist signage. The kind of place my parents never would have stepped foot in. I don't feel anger when I see it. I feel closure, the kind that says, this chapter is over. Let the next one begin. If you asked me what I learned, I'd tell you this. Being underestimated is a gift if you know how to use it, and silence when wielded by the right person is sharper than any weapon. So no, I didn't destroy them, they simply collapsed under the weight of their own choices. And I chose peace. What would you have done differently? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more real revenge stories every day on Outlaw Alley. Comment, like, subscribe, share with someone who needs to hear this today.